Chapter 29. Go away! Leave me alone! I woke up shouting. I gasped, then started crying uncontrollably. I hadn't thought I would fall asleep, but the hunger and fear and exhaustion had overwhelmed me sometime in the early hours of the morning, and I'd ended up dozing off into one of the nightmares that had plagued me since my accident, the reason I needed my medication before sleeping. I cursed myself through my tears that just this one time, it hadn't been the insomnia that had claimed me instead. It was still raining, but the world was faintly lighter, which meant the sun was probably rising. Thankfully, it was still mostly dry, though I'd had to pull off my shirt during the night and use it to cover my head from the drops that were still falling off the leaves of the tree above me. When it was light enough to see the path in front of me, I dressed and headed out again, my faithful fern covering my head. I was exhausted and hungry, but I couldn't just sit still. Keep moving. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. The only other option is to sit down and give up, and I'm not ready to give up yet. I started repeating my mantra to myself again. It felt futile, but it was all I had to ward off the hopelessness that was growing inside me. I found myself stopping often that morning. I simply didn't have the energy to keep the pace I'd been going at the day before. I drank water pooled on plants and eventually found some more berries, which I practically inhaled. When the rain let up, the sun was almost directly overhead again. I was grateful for the warmth on my shoulders and back as I stepped out from under the trees. I thought I was hallucinating when, some hours later, I saw people on a raft in the river. They had golden tan skin and were skimpily dressed. The raft, nothing more than a bunch of logs tied together, was anchored to the shore in two places. They were fishing. Yedramora? They didn't seem to notice me as I walked slowly along the perimeter of the jungle. I watched them for a moment, my excitement in finding humans warring with my anxiety of not knowing if they would help me or attack. But I was desperate. I'd probably die anyway if I didn't get some help. Hello? I called to them, stepping forward. No response, so I called louder. Hello? All three of them turned to look at me at the same time. One called something that sounded like Ila and waved. Then all three started pulling the raft to the shore along one of the anchor lines. I backed up as they came closer. 2 men and 1 woman, I noted. A large crate took up one side of the raft, maybe to store the fish they caught. They pulled the raft safely onto the shore before turning back to me. One of the men stepped forward, both hands held out to the side in a sign of non-aggression. Ila, the man said again. I shook my head. Poturis, he tried again. He pronounced it like po-tu-ris. Portuguese? I offered. Você fala português? He asked. He spoke it slowly like someone who had tried to learn Portuguese but hadn't been taught the right pronunciation. Do you speak Portuguese? Sim, I replied, nodding. Yes. He grinned. Lost are you? Yes, I replied again. Come you with us? Or home we take you to? I hesitated only for an instant. After a day in the wilderness, my natural instincts were to be wary of everything in the Amazon, but they were people, actual people, and they spoke Portuguese. I'd tried not to let my excitement get too high when I'd seen them, but now I gave in. Yes, thank you. I knew I was grinning like an idiot, but I didn't care. Come. He gestured to the raft and I quickly climbed on. The other 2 pulled up the anchors and all 3 pushed the raft back into the water. The woman and one of the men picked up 2 long oars I hadn't seen and started steering the raft downstream. Where you are from? The first man asked. Belim, I replied. But I don't know how I got lost here. Wandered too far? I laughed ruefully. No, I was on a boat, fell asleep, woke up in the jungle. Strange. I nodded. He seemed to think for a moment. You need water? I nodded enthusiastically. Please. He opened the chest. It had 2 compartments and only half of the lid came up. He reached in and pulled out a water skin. He handed it to me and I drank gratefully. Only after I'd nearly emptied the bottle did I realize maybe I shouldn't have drunk it all. I'm sorry, I said regretfully, handing it back to him. I drank it all. He smiled reassuringly and held up his hands, refusing to take it back. It okay. You drink all you want. Soon home we are. Thank you, I said, and finished the water. Filling my stomach with anything helped slake the hunger for a moment, too. What your name? The girl asked. I turned, surprised at the new voice. Zoe, I answered. She nodded. I Katali. I turned back to the man I'd been speaking to. I am Rasitu. Katali Rasitu. I repeated the names to myself, trying to make sure I would remember them. When I got out of the jungle, it might be important. Thank you for helping me, I said gratefully. Rasitu inclined his head. It is good to help, he answered. We rounded a bend in the river, and I saw an island ahead of us. There were other rafts and boats anchored in an enclosed space, and a group of people who seemed to be watching for us loitered on the shore. I took a double take at the watercraft. Were those speedboats? No, they couldn't be. Katali and the other man, whose name I hadn't been told, guided the raft into the port, and I heard murmuring from the gathered crowd, though I couldn't understand anything they were saying. A man stepped forward from the group, distinguished from the others by rows of bright feathers braided into his long hair. Greetings, stranger, he greeted me in nearly perfectly accented Portuguese. Welcome to our fiku. I didn't recognize the last word, but attempted a smile as I stepped off the raft. The people staring at me were making me uncomfortable. Hello, I said. I am Terafu, leader of my fiku. Please come. He gestured behind him, and the crowd parted respectfully. I followed Terafu into the trees. From the shore, the only signs that anyone lived on the island were the water vessels in the enclosure. But after only a few steps in, I saw a Yedramora city that no other humans had probably ever seen. The ground was clear of large plants, though smaller ones had been allowed to continue growing. Wooden houses were built around the trunks of wide, sturdy trees. Most were 2 floors high. Paths between the houses were paved with large, smooth stones. Vines draped from branches, dropping onto rooftops and swaying between buildings. Except for the gaily painted pictures on some of the buildings, it looked like the cities Hollywood had always designed for forest-dwelling elves. I stared around myself in wonder. Terafu stopped walking and watched me. This is not what I expected, I finally managed. Terafu smiled. I think you were not expecting to find us at all. I nodded. Yeah. You are called Zoe, yes? I looked at him in surprise. How did you know? He paused a moment, considering his answer. I am strong in far-talking. I do not know what you call it. Telepathy? I suggested. If that is what you call it, then yes. As leader, I am the strongest far-talker in the Fiku. The man you came with, Rasitu, is also strong in far-talking, and he told me you were coming. He also told many friends. That is why so many were waiting for your arrival. He gave a disapproving look. Too young to know not to talk too much. I laughed under my breath. I know a lot of people like that, too. My thoughts, though, were uneasy. Telepaths could only talk to each other if they could see each other, unless they just shouted their thoughts into the void. But that only worked short range. That's what we learned and how it always worked. Outside the Amazon, I reminded myself again, perhaps all talents work differently in the so-called magic lands. He started walking again, and I followed. He had a distant look on his face, and I didn't want to interrupt his thoughts, so I stayed silent and just kept looking around the Fiku, as he called it. Village, probably, I thought. Tona! I suddenly heard a voice call out behind us. I turned to see a cat racing away from a building, a sandal in its mouth, and a small child chasing after it. Didu Sikumi! I looked closer at the cat as it ran past us and between 2 other buildings. It looked more like a kitten, really. An orange, spotted... Is that a jaguar cub? I asked in disbelief. Terafu nodded. They make good pets. They are very responsive to far talking. Very smart animals. Oh. I looked from the place where the cat had disappeared to Terafu. How do you get the babies from the mom? He frowned. What do you mean? Doesn't the mom, attack you? He paused a moment, then smiled in understanding. They are not wild. We have the mother and father first. Oh, I said simply. I wasn't sure I wanted to know how they caught the adult breeders. We reached a small 2-story building with a white door and blue door frame. This is where you will stay, Terafu said. It has been prepared for you. What? I asked dumbly. I have a house? We have been expecting you, he said slowly. Wait, what? I stared at him in surprise and fear. What do you mean? How could you know I was coming? Our Sikuni saw you lost in Asonu and saw you would come this way. Our fishing people were to catch food and wait for you. I stood silent for a moment, trying to process what he had said. What's a Sikuni? Was all I could manage. A Sikuni is the future seer of the Fiku. She looks at all futures and finds the one with the most chance of happening. I blinked several times. Sees all the futures? Was that even possible? As far as I knew, precogs could only see events that were already determined to happen. But then, my precognitions had been acting oddly since I'd gotten lost in the jungle, so maybe it was possible? So you made a house ready for me? Terafu laughed. It is for all visitors. You are not the only one to come here, but you are the first from outside Asonu. You mean there are more Yedramora around? I felt like an idiot the moment after I asked it. Of course they weren't the only ones in the entire Amazon rainforest. He just nodded, though. Many tribes, but none in a day's travel by boat or foot. Now come. We went inside, and I had just enough time to see a table and chairs to one side of the room before we turned and went up a set of stairs. Half a dozen beds elevated on wooden box frames were spaced around the single large room, a small table next to each. This is where you will sleep. We have all beds on top to avoid nighttime ground creatures. I do not know if maybe you are tired now. I think being outside all night, you may not have slept very well. I didn't bother asking how he knew how long I'd been in the jungle. I guessed his Sikuni had told him. And it was true, I was extremely tired, but I didn't think I'd be able to sleep just then. I was too wired with anxiety and excitement and fear and wonder to even sit still. Not right now, thank you. I looked at him pleadingly. Do you know how I can get hold of people, my people, so I can get home? He was silent for a long moment. I recognized the look on his face as the same one he'd had earlier, as if his thoughts were somewhere else completely. Maybe they were. Perhaps, he said slowly. I understand you wish to go home, but our Sikuni would like to talk to you first. When? Now? I asked. My anxiety had risen again at his answer. Perhaps? Does that mean he didn't know? Or that there was a way and he might not tell me? Would they hold me here against my will? It does not have to be right away. If you do not want to sleep, maybe you would like to eat first. My stomach growled loudly at the mention of food. I grimaced in embarrassment. Terafu laughed. I think that is yes. Come down with me and I will get you something to eat. We descended the stairs, and he motioned me to the table and chairs I'd seen earlier. I took a seat, and Terafu opened a trapdoor in the floor that I hadn't noticed. He climbed down a ladder and disappeared from view. Root cellar? I looked around the room as I waited. I couldn't see around the far side of the tree trunk, but high on the walls were decorations that looked like lights? And the window in the wall actually had glass in it. I'd assumed the Yedramora had little to no technology, given its primitive appearance, but it appeared I might be wrong. After all, if they could make advanced bombs that the smartest humans couldn't understand, why couldn't they also have electricity and glassmithing? Terafu reemerged shortly, carrying a basket over his arm. Are you sure you need to be doing all that? I asked as he set the basket on the table. I mean, you're chief, right? Don't you have, other people to do stuff for you? I realized I was babbling in my uncertainty and snapped my mouth shut. Terafu gave me that understanding smile again. How am I any different from others here? Why should I do any less than them? You are my guest, so I must make you feel safe and comfortable, yes? He had a point. In my mind, I had placed Terafu in equal status to some rich mayor of a city who had housekeepers to do all his cleaning and cooking. But the customs of the outside human world were not necessarily the same as those who lived separately from it. Who knew what they thought and felt and believed? And in that moment, as much as I wanted to get home, I also realized that I was in the entirely unique position to learn about a people who had never been observed before, the Yedramora. The part of me that always wanted to learn about other cultures soared at the thought of being able to learn about them, not just from stories and archaeology finds, but from the living people themselves. Terafu unpacked some fruit and smoked meat from the basket, as well as a jug of water. I looked at him, not sure if I was supposed to say or do anything before I started eating. Thank you, I said. Terafu nodded, his eyes smiling. Eat as much as you want. I nodded and picked up a piece of meat as Terafu turned and left.